All right, good morning. Let's begin. So last time we looked at the overlap between the visions of Zechariah and the messianic prophecies, because in chapter 3 there's a vision that includes a messianic passage, and we started here on the first of the second half of Zechariah has a lot of prophecies that are almost entirely messianic. And the first example we read here, and I underline words that have messianic meanings that need to be discussed. And the first part of this passage, we noted that he was told to take silver and gold and make crowns, plural. And a lot of, the Hebrew's plural, but a lot of translations make it singular because it seems like the crowns are being set on only one head, the head of Joshua, the high priest. And so a lot of the translators would speculate that maybe it's like a double crown, a silver and a gold in one piece, which certainly may be, but the Hebrew says crowns, and we looked at the implications of that, and the passage continued. Here's a man whose name is Branch. He will branch out from his place and build the Lord's temple. Yes, he will build the Lord's temple. He will be clothed in splendor and will sit on his throne and rule. There will also be a priest on his throne, and there will be peaceful counsel between the two of them. The crown will reside in the Lord's temple as a memorial to the names from the Babylonian exile who brought the gold and silver. People who are far off will come and build the Lord's temple. And you will know that the Lord of hosts has sent me to you, and this will happen when you fully obey the Lord your God. So the first thing we looked at last week was this language about crowns. And we noted that it really is plural, but only a minority of English translations leave it as plural. Josiah, the high priest, or Joshua or Yeshua in Hebrew, is a symbol of the future Messiah. And if you go through all the messianic prophecies, you notice that the Messiah is the coming king, but he's also the coming new high priest. So the Messiah has at least two roles. He's also, it's told as far back as the time of Moses that there's one coming who will be a greater prophet even than Moses. He's a new prophet. And then, of course, he is the suffering servant. Somehow this Messiah is going to die for the sins of the people. So there are four aspects to the Messiah and the Messianic prophecy, and it was difficult for the Jews to understand how one person could be all of these things, and we'll return to that. But the language is many crowns are on one head. There's many roles on one person, and that actually is echoed later in the book of Revelation, where it's many crowns are on his head, a vision that John was having of the Son of God at the right hand of the Father in heaven. Now, although this might be confusing to the Jews, there is some preparation in the Old Testament. There are some examples of people who have multiple roles like this. Melchizedek, we'll take a look at. Moses was both prophet and priest. Moses was from the tribe of Levi and could serve as priest and did, and his brother Aaron was the high priest. But of course, Moses was also a prophet, the deliverer of the messages of God. 5 books worth. So David surprisingly, was not just king, but he was prophet. Whenever he wrote a message from the Lord in one of the Psalms, and we'll look at some language in the Psalms where he explicitly says this is from God. It's not just his own poem. He was a prophet in that sense, in addition to being a king. But surprisingly, there are a couple of examples where he acted as priest under God's approval, offering sacrifices on behalf of the nation. So it is certainly not without precedent to have multiple roles for one person. And I closed last week by mentioning how when Peter in 1 Peter said to us, "You are a royal priesthood." I always kind of skipped over the word royal. I just thought, oh, Peter's saying we are the new priesthood. There's not an Old Testament priesthood anymore. All Christians are now priests. Well, that's true. We are the new priesthood. But he didn't say the new priesthood. He said the royal priesthood, and the word royal, in some sense, doesn't really go with priesthood, does it? Because in the Old Testament, unless God is making one of these exceptions that we're looking at, the priest is from the tribe of Levi. The Messianic king line passes through the tribe of Judah and goes all the way back to Genesis when Judah is prophesied to be the line from which the king comes. David is from the tribe of Judah. His descendants on the throne are from the tribe of Judah. And so it would seem like you can't have one person be the same thing. So royal priesthood, which we are, means we serve a royal priest. We serve the new Messianic king. But we also serve the new high priest of a new covenant. And so it just recently it hit home to me that what is Peter saying here? So you know how it is sometimes in the Bible you read something over and over and you just kind of pass over the implications of it. Peter says you're a royal priesthood. You're serving a king. You're in the king's court. But you're also serving a high priest. So David, for example, was a prophet. Every time he wrote Psalms, there's a famous Psalm 110 that David begins, "The Lord said to my Lord." And Jesus quotes this, doesn't he? Jesus quotes it as, how could he say that? Who was he talking about? There's two Lords in that verse. David is saying he got this message from the Lord when he says, "The Lord said." Well, who the Lord said to my Lord? That implies that David is thinking of someone else besides the Father as his Lord. And Jesus questioned the Jews who were questioning him. Who's he talking about? Jesus was trying to drive home the point that the Messiah was always prophesied to be divine. David is speaking of the Messiah. The Lord, the Father, said to my Lord, the Messiah. So they should have been, the Jews of Jesus' day should have been open to the message that the Messiah is divine. The Messiah is not just a man that's sent by God to teach. David calls him my Lord. And the other point that Jesus made was the Messiah is the son of David, that is, the descendant of David. And yet, David calls one of his descendants my Lord. That's something for them to think about, and they didn't really have an answer to it. In 2 Samuel, we have an interesting passage here in which David behaves as a priest. They brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent David had pitched for it, the tabernacle. Then David offered burnt offerings in the Lord's presence. When David had finished offering the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts, or Lord of armies. This was with God's approval, which is important because what happened with King Saul? King Saul presumed on his own authority one time to offer sacrifices without God asking him to. And what happened? The prophet Samuel arrived, who was also a prophet and a priest. He had two roles. And when Samuel arrived and found that the sacrifices had already been offered, he said to obey is better than to sacrifice, and the Lord is going to take away your kingship. And the kingship was not passed down through Saul, who was from the tribe of Benjamin, but rather was given to David. And then the whole messianic line comes from David. So you can't presume upon yourself, if you're the king, to behave like you're also a priest and offer sacrifices. You have to have God's approval. And a long example, the entire 24th chapter of 2 Samuel, we'll just summarize. David acted on his own authority to go do a military census of the people. And God saw that in his heart, the reason he was doing a military census was he wasn't really trusting in the Lord to win any upcoming battles. He was trying to calculate his own power. And God rebuked him, and God punished the people. And when he brought the punishment to an end, he had the prophet Gad, the royal prophet at the time, come to David and say, offer sacrifices on behalf of the people. He was told to offer the sacrifices. And at the end of the last verse of 2 Samuel 24, David has offered the sacrifices that he was asked to by God. He didn't presume upon himself to act like a priest. God actually gave him the word through Gad, offer sacrifices. And he offered sacrifice. He didn't go to the priest and say, please offer sacrifices. David did it. So David is a type, in the Old Testament typology, of the coming Messiah. He's king, he's prophet, and he's priest on occasion. Right? So this is not some idea that suddenly pops up in the New Testament or that Christians come up with to justify something. This was something they're prepared for. Now we have the mysterious character Melchizedek. Melchizedek was identified as the first person to be called a righteous king in the Bible. He's called the king of Salem. Salem was Jerusalem. Before it was called Jerusalem, it's called Salem. So there's something a little bit messianic right there, to be the king of Jerusalem. And he came out to Abram before he was even renamed Abraham. He met him after a battle, and it says, Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest to God Most High. So he's a king and a priest. And he delivers a message from God like a prophet would. He blessed him and said, Abram is blessed by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has handed over your enemies to you. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. So Melchizedek is fulfilling three different roles: prophet, priest, and king, all at once. And so this is another typological reference to the Messiah. This is a person who is like the Messiah. Now in the book of Hebrews, reference is made to Melchizedek. And the point of the reference in Hebrews is Melchizedek wasn't a priest because he was from the tribe of Levi and inherited it. Levi didn't exist yet. That's generations into the future. That's hundreds of years later. He didn't inherit the priesthood. You don't have to be of a certain tribe and inherit. You can be chosen by God to be the priest. Melchizedek was chosen by God, and Christ, Jesus Christ, is referred to as a high priest in the order, or which really means in the manner of Melchizedek. Christ is a new high priest in the same way that Melchizedek was a priest, namely, not by his genealogy or by his inheriting it, but by being chosen by God. Now, some people have misinterpreted the statement that he had no genealogy to make it, well, maybe he was like an angel or something, or maybe he wasn't human, or it's not saying that, I don't think. It's saying we don't know his genealogy. It's not given. It's irrelevant because he didn't inherit anything. He didn't inherit the kingship or the priesthood. So the point that the author of Hebrews makes in Hebrews chapter 7, I believe, is that you can be a high priest because God declares you to be the priest. You don't have to just inherit it. And that's a type of Jesus Christ. Now, it's kind of interesting that Melchizedek appears in some of the documents that were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. You've probably heard the story that there was a community south of Jerusalem in the desert called the Essenes, the Qumran community, and one of the things they did was make copies of Bible books by hand, but they also had some of their own documents, their own order of discipline of their community, and some documents that we found. And back in about, 1946 or so, some boy was out, his dad was a shepherd in this remote area, and there were these caves, and the boy would fling rocks up into caves, like we heard in the sermon today. Boys like to tear things up and blow things up and so on, right? He flings rocks into a cave, they go down, the sheep go down, he flings a rock into another cave and he hears crash. What was that? They go up into the cave and they find that there are all these pottery urns in this cave, and he just smashed one of them. And you can look inside the smashed one and see there's papyrus scroll in there. And so all of these scrolls were discovered, many of which were copies of Old Testament books. And the Essene community was present there from the 2nd century BC to the 1st century BC and on into the 1st century AD. And so before the time of Christ, we have these Dead Sea Scrolls. And one of the amazing things about the Dead Sea Scrolls is that the oldest Hebrew Bibles that we had before that dated from about 1000 AD. There was a Hebrew Bible from Leningrad, which has now been renamed St. Petersburg in Russia. And when the various Bibles, like the King James Bible and so on, were made, those were the best copies you could get of the Hebrew Bible and used to translate into English and other languages. And you can get these fragments of books, sometimes a whole lot of a book, almost all the books, sometimes less, and you can compare, and they're almost word for word, letter for letter identical, with small exceptions, to what we have from 1000 AD, which indicates that at least from about 200 BC to the present time, there was really meticulous copying of the Old Testament. And so the Dead Sea Scrolls were pretty inspirational in that sense. But there were these other documents. One of them is referred to as the Melchizedek scroll because is about Melchizedek, although it's just a fragment. It's probably a piece of a bigger book that's not necessarily all about Melchizedek. But it talks about Melchizedek as a messianic figure, as a type of the Messiah. It even identifies him with the name of God. It identifies him as the anointed one of one of Daniel's messianic prophecies. And there's another document in there called the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. Now, this is a book it's not a genuine book of the Bible. It's kind of a pretend that the 12 sons of Jacob, the patriarchs of the 12 tribes of Israel, each wrote out their last will and testament, right before they died or something. But it's kind of interesting to see what they believed. And it associates, in one of the books, the Melchizedek with two messianic figures, one of whom was a descendant of David, a kingly descendant, and one of whom was a descendant of Levi. And it seems like they were just on the verge, the Jews were kind of just on the verge of merging these two figures together. I've mentioned before that the Jews had a hard time understanding these messianic passages. How can one man be the king and the priest and the new prophet and the suffering servant? And so most of the early Jewish interpretations were, it's not just one Messiah. There's a Messiah who's the king, and then there's somebody who accompanies him who is the new high priest. And then there's also somebody who accompanies him who's the suffering servant. And maybe one of those three is also a new prophet. Maybe it's the Messiah himself, the king, who's also a new prophet. Because there's no problem with the king being a prophet. It's just that king being a priest that's the stumbling block. And so the Jews would often think of this as like three people. The Messiah and two helpers. But it seems like right before the time of Christ, they were pondering this and they were on the verge of realizing that, it could be one person. They're pondering the type of Melchizedek and saying, actually the king and the priest could be one person. Perhaps. But they still couldn't figure out, maybe as you trace your genealogy, part of your genealogy goes back to Levi and part of it goes back to David or something, through tribes intermarrying. So they couldn't quite figure it out and they weren't quite there yet. Now back to the Zechariah prophecy and the language in it. It says he's going to build the temple. Well, at the time that Zechariah was receiving this prophecy, Zerubbabel, who we might call a king, but since they were dominated by the Persians at the time, who had taken over the Babylonian Empire, he's more properly the governor. But he's a descendant of David. He's on the throne in Jerusalem, but he's really just a governor. He and the high priest, Joshua, are repairing the temple from the destruction of the Babylonian siege earlier. And so they're working on repairing the temple. So what does it mean that this Messiah is going to come someday and rebuild the temple? The temple is already being rebuilt. If it were talking about a physical rebuilding of the temple, that would not really make sense. One writer compared it to, you're in Hiroshima, Japan, a couple of years after the atom bomb was dropped on it in 1945, and they're rebuilding it. And you give a prediction about the rebuilding of it, but then you say, well, no, I'm not talking about the rebuilding that's going on right now in front of your face. I'm saying that hundreds of years from now, it's going to get destroyed again and rebuilt again. Well, who could possibly interpret your words that way? If you're standing there talking about the rebuilding of it while the rebuilding's going on, if it's a physical rebuilding, everybody's going to think of that, aren't they? So it has to be a spiritual rebuilding in the future Messiah. And in the New Testament, it's made clear, but there are hints that we will see in the Old Testament, that the Messiah builds a spiritual temple. And that temple is built out of us, people, believers. We are the stones of this new temple. And we see that kind of New Testament language, for example, in 1 Corinthians. Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? Making an analogy to God's Spirit coming down into the physical temple. If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him, for God's temple is holy, and you are that temple. And again in 1 Peter, as you come to him, a living stone, rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen and precious, you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Now, this might seem very different from the Old Testament, where they thought of God as coming to earth and dwelling in the temple, in the Holy of Holies, and so on. But actually, there's language in the Old Testament about God dwelling outside of the temple, spiritually. In the Old Testament, God alternated sometimes between talking about dwelling in the temple and it being his house, and going out and dwelling in the midst of the people. And the people, therefore, by analogy, are his temple, the way Peter said they're the stones of the temple. For example, in Leviticus, I will place my residence among you, and I will not reject you. I will walk among you and be your God, and you will be my people. So in the first verse, he's talking about a residence, a building. I'm going to put that in your midst, in Jerusalem. But I'm going to go out and walk among you. So he's not only going to be accessible through this physical temple. And likewise, in the reverse order, in Ezekiel, my dwelling place will be with them. I will be their God, and they will be my people. And then he switches back to the physical temple. When my sanctuary is among them, that's a building, forever, the nations will know that I, the Lord, sanctify Israel. So there are already hints in the Old Testament of this. Now, the remaining passage that we had in Zechariah was that this king is going to be on his throne, but there's going to be a priest on his throne. And there's harmony between them. Well, but priests don't sit on thrones in the Old Covenant. So once again, this is a sign that there is one throne with that one plural crown on one head, and the only person mentioned in the passage is the high priest, Joshua. Now, when the Old Testament was translated a few centuries before Christ into Greek, they didn't understand this, and so they explicitly said in the Greek, well, at his right hand, there's this king on his throne, and at his right hand is this priest. But there's absolutely nothing in the Hebrew about two different places and at his right hand. None of those words even occur in the Hebrew. They were trying to make sense out of a passage that was difficult because Once again, how can the priest and the king be the same person? And how can a priest sit on a throne, and so on? So they kind of made it up, So all of these examples of messianic language indicate that the high priest Joshua is a type of the future Messiah. And that's interesting because most of the Old Testament types of the Messiah were kings. And here there's a priest. There's a high priest who's the type of the future Messiah. And he gets multiple crowns. He's fulfilling multiple roles. And this idea of a priest receiving a crown, combined with similar messianic references, indicate that these roles of priest and king are going to be combined in the Messiah. So it might be a little confusing to the Jews, but when Jesus Christ came along, they should have been a little bit prepared to see this fulfilled, right? So, thank you.